Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan, and today we have an illustrious guest. With me today is Douglas London. Douglas is a retired, decorated 34-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service, whose experience includes headquarters executive positions and foreign field assignments, which we will go into, as a station chief across the Middle East, South Asia, former republics, and Africa. He's a certified intelligence educator and taught operational tradecraft CIA Special Training Center. He's certified in hostile environment tradecraft, and he currently maintains a TS SCI clearance. I think Douglas mainly is known for his fantastic book, The Recruiter, Spying on the Lost Art of American Intelligence, which came out in 2021. And he's also currently, as if he doesn't have enough to do, Adjunct Associate Professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and he's also an adjunct lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Relations. And outside of that, he's a contributor to an analyst for many outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, PBS, NPR, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Political, The Hill, Cipher Brief, The Messenger, Just Security, and now Great Dynamics. So thank you for joining us, Doug.
Thanks. It's great to be with you and your audience. I'm exhausted just from hearing my bio.
I mean, you have an illustrious long career, so it deserves me going into it. How did you start it into this? Was it something you always wanted growing up, or was it serendipitous?
It's a great question. I get it. I get it a lot. And my answer makes people kind of cringe, but I basically wound up with the CIA because I didn't have any marketable skills. And
Okay.
you have to remember my career spanned 4 decades, the 80s until 2019. And back in the 80s, we were in a fairly low tech, at best, analog world. Today, the CIA has a website. They're open for business. People apply online and get their essays get reviewed, and they have different pathways. For me, in my time, there was less known about the agency. There were certainly less people like me writing books, and the agency was a little bit more tight-lipped. So they essentially found me. I had a professor at college who, like me, was an adjunct. He had been a career foreign service officer. He was an incredibly cool guy. I wanted to be him when I grew up, sort of thing. He was articulate. He was a Marine veteran, served, fought in Iwo Jima, had been an ambassador. And I thought, wow, that's what I want to do, right? For my life, that's really kind of cool. But I was a street kid. I was from the Bronx, South Bronx, actually, New York. So I was probably a little bit rough around the edges. And he had a relationship with the agency from his time at the UN. He was one of multiple ambassadors we had at any given moment. And he passed him my name. And I'd like to think he passed my name because, he thought I might be a good fit, as opposed to, I got to do something to keep this guy out of the US diplomatic corps.
Yeah. All right. And what's then if you can go into that, but what's then the first step? How do you hear about it? And
So I got a phone call on one morning, and I was working multiple jobs. I was a security guard, I was a taxi driver, and I'd worked all night, and I was trying to get some sleep. The phone rang, and I thought, I won't even answer it, but I did. And there was a gentleman on the other end of the line who identified himself as a U.S. federal government official. There's a whole lot of detail for you there. And he said, Mr. London, we know a little bit about you, and we'd very much like you to attend a job workshop. And I said, what job? And he said, well, you'll find out when you get here. And I went downtown. It was New York City. It was then Jacob Javits building. I don't know if that's still even there. And found the room. It was some waiting area. There were a bunch of people, and like the gentlemen were in suits, and the ladies were, well dressed. And I was in a pair of jeans and a ripped sweatshirt. So it was like, I looked around and I thought, this is probably off to a bad start. But it was an information workshop, and it's not too different than what they do today. Only today, applicants know where they're going, they know what they're doing. And the gentleman gave sort of an overview. This is about the CIA. This is about the director of operations, the clandestine service. Tell you a little bit about it, very little. And if you're interested, stay behind, fill out these forms, and I'll see each one of you individually. And I listened to the guy, and he didn't say much, but he talked about foreign travel, intrigue, taking risks, serving your country. And I thought, that sounds pretty cool. So I stuck around, filled out the paperwork, and it led to a series of tests and interviews, which still is the case today. The applicants have a little more insight into what they're going through, and a screening filtering process, which I was fortunate enough to make it through and get selected as a candidate for what was then called the career trainee program. Today, the director of operations hires for the clandestine service training program. And the logic to that was back in my day in the 80s, the assumption was if you join the agency or any place, right? If you think about maybe your, folks' parents and stuff like that, they expected to do that job for their whole career. But generational changes in today's era, folks don't necessarily figure I'm going to do this for the next 30, 40 years. I'm going to do this, see what it's like, maybe get some experience, grow myself, and take that someplace else. So the name has changed.
Hmm, interesting. What struck me when you mentioned your background and your upbringing, when you get into the CIA, and especially during that time, which I can say that CIA is often seen as an elitist organization, and people from the ideas of people with Ivy League backgrounds and Rhodes Scholars and this type of stuff. Um, Not necessarily saying that you are not a good student, but mainly socially. From that background, um, did you did you feel out of place?
I like where you're going with this. No,
Yeah.
I was different than most of my other
Mhm.
classmates, and I think even today the agency places a lot of stress on your college, where you went to school, what your background was. I was really lucky. I was well, my first interviewer called a second story guy, which in our jingle really means somebody who breaks into places and stuff. Which maybe I might have done when I was younger. Now after that, I only did it for my country. But if you think about what an operations officer has to be prepared for, it's adversity, it's challenges, it's the unexpected, it's risks that you could do all your planning for, but to which you have to have the natural capacity and the training to address. And in my background, I think I had various manners of challenges and adversity and things I had to overcome and situations where I had to sort of talk my way out of, which is very
Mhm.
much what a case officer does. And I think folks who are, come from a more comfortable background don't necessarily have as many challenges. They're certainly very smart, but they've not got the experience perhaps as somebody who's gone through more difficulties, somebody who maybe, went to community college or worked their way through school or, had to go through challenges. They'll get there perhaps if the the battery of tests we all take shows them to have the inner capacity. But the work of espionage, the more experience you have, the better you get. Then sort of the diminishing returns is the older you get, the harder it gets. So, you know, my head is great, but it's a young person's game these days. But I think looking for folks who have the integrity that you want, which is the most essential thing. It has to be somebody who you could trust without like the police have dash cams and body cams. You can't have that in espionage, ideally. So we've got to believe in you. You got to be someone who doesn't take shortcuts, who's going to be the first one to identify a wart or a mistake, be self-aware, be accountable. So that mix is an interesting mix that you need to find, and it's not in everyone.
Yeah. Is that what they often call the difference between book smarts and street smarts?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think to be a good spy, you have to have a little bit of both.
Mhm.
You have to maybe a lot of bit of both. So, I always thought I had the street smart part. I never thought I was a scholar, but I worked really hard. And
Mhm.
in your work as a case officer, you're not supposed to be an expert in everything other than operational
Mhm.
tradecraft.
Mhm.
So I would recruit and handle pilots, nuclear scientists, people who were brilliant. And I
Mhm.
didn't have to be as brilliant as them in their field. I mean, that was the point. They were supposed to educate me with
Mhm.
that. I had to be brilliant on keeping them alive.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, to keep on going on this, but and I asked this also because of my own experiences, but um, in organizations like that, where there's a lot of smart people, a lot of ambitious people, a lot of sharp elbows, do you feel that you had to maybe work harder or convincing your colleagues? It's not necessarily, the leadership, but fitting in, as it were.
Personally, I don't feel that way. Maybe I was overconfident. I felt very capable. Perhaps I was a little too arrogant as well, and like to kind of crow a little bit about my successes because you can only crow in house. What we do is secret. So I can't go home. I can't tell friends, but I can make sure my colleagues know of something I accomplished. So I don't think that was ever an issue. But to your point, I mean, the CIA, particularly the DO, they're hiring alpha personalities. These are all smart, competitive, ambitious people. The difference is that ambition has to be tempered by the cohesion of knowing you're doing this for, God and country, and we're one team, and you've got to be flawlessly honest with everyone. You could be a little bit of rough elbows at the times, but I think, that works against you because people have long memories and people have long daggers. And so, it's best to find, a constructive engagement with your colleagues. And I think I might have learned that a bit too late in my career as I went along. But I think certainly as I got older and I moved the ranks, I realized, you got to sort of temper some of that stuff and make sure that even when you disagree, you're not disagreeable.
Mhm. You mentioned in the beginning that obviously now the CIA is open for business. It has a website and there's a lot of emphasis on technology. Um, since you wrote the book on it, literally, how do you see the evolution, or if there is one, of human intelligence, and particularly with the rise of technology, biometrics, these kind of things?
Yeah, it's a cool topic and it's a critical topic. Technology shouldn't frighten you as an intel officer, as an intel service. It's fundamentally human intelligence is about human beings. So as long as human beings are the ones who make the decisions and are in charge, then they're the ones from whom we need to get information, exploiting technology, obviously, to enable sometimes technical collection as well as, targeting and such like that. Spying is, my book was originally titled The Second Oldest Profession. It's been around forever. I might, argue that it was the first oldest profession that told people where to go for the next profession. But people are still people, and people still have emotions and feelings and needs, and they get angry and they get happy. And that's still what spies are leveraging to recruit agents, to recruit human agents. The change is the mechanics, and the mechanics do reflect the technology of the day. Think about the changes from, the wireless, right, and then telephones, and then cell phones, and then computers, and now the evolution of surveillance states. So the way a spy goes out and meets their target and handles their target certainly different. Certainly has to reflect the times, and I think is a far more scrupulous art just in terms of targeting individuals than it ever was, because it has to be, because you need to be so wary of your digital footprint, which is everywhere nowadays. But it's never going to go away as long as there are leaders who make decisions and people who work for them who implement them. There's going to be the opportunity for espionage.
Yeah, for certain. Since you've been uh, in the organization for so long, uh, well, the shift happened from, what most people traditionally see as how intelligence being a gentleman's, game, and more ideas of on James Bond and less Jason Bourne, to the war on terror. How did you experience that shift in more focus on operational paramilitary organization?
Yeah, so I talk about that in my book and trying to sort of compare and contrast and offer maybe the road ahead. My career pretty much split evenly between the Cold War and then 9/11. My 34 plus years kind of fell evenly on both sides. I don't think it was ever a gentleman's game, to be honest. It's all about dirty tricks and ruthlessness. The exception being the mechanics of how you recruit agents. To that point, I think liberal democracies, and we could talk about this further if you want separately, tend to look at how to motivate people into cooperate, where autocracies tend to look at vulnerabilities that they can control and exploit. So that's always been the case. But how we deal with one another as services, I wouldn't say it's a gentleman's game. I think what happens with the direction of any institution is it aligns with the decision makers. And certainly after 9/11, the United States and much of most of our liberal democratic friends were scared to death about terrorism. And frankly, I would suggest, and people are saying this now, and maybe more, maybe overreacted a little bit. So the CIA was certainly part of that reaction. And during the war on terrorism, it was all about preemptive defense, which is essentially a legalistic way of allowing you to go and kill people before they can kill you. Even if you just think by their association with a terrorist group, which seems legitimate, that they're a threat, which means institutionally our focus became on that. And so the agency sort of shifted its resources and shifted its culture to one that did reflect a more military, paramilitary atmosphere. And at a price, I think, today, because the shift now, we're back to great power, near strategic, near peer, whatever you want to define it, competition among big states or even small states for that matter. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea primarily are the probably the top four US targets in that big bad world, which is a lot more nuanced, which is a lot more focused on collecting intelligence for insight and understanding, as opposed to collecting intelligence to find people and make them go away. So, did the agency go short on the investment they needed to evolve with the technical landscape as it evolved, with the move to hybrid warfare, gray warfare, if you rather, a gray
Mhm.
that's what your podcast
Yeah,
is, right? That's
yeah.
certainly the Russians and our principal adversaries reflect. Yeah, perhaps, but luckily, there's a core institution and a culture, and the foundation is based on spying.
Mhm.
So I believe the agency has been able to sort of move itself back to what I think its fundamental mission always has been, which is a foreign intelligence service, which primarily collects intelligence. Yeah, we do covert action. We still do. We always will. Oh no, maybe can't say that.
Mhm.
But our what makes the CIA unique for the United States intel community is it is the, as you said, elite foreign intelligence service that goes abroad and does the hardest things in terms of collecting the most difficult secrets. So I think we've been moving back and we've been making progress, if only by what can you can see in public, right? The
Mhm.
CIA recently put out two videos targeting Chinese officials. I thought they were excellent. They were very different than the ones targeting Russians, which reflected good targeting.
Mhm.
Kind of in brief, the Chinese videos were much more transactional, much more focused on corruption and elitism, and they're getting theirs, so you should get yours. And the
Mhm.
Russian videos were much more focused on emotions,
Mhm.
patriotism, nationalism, that your country is being squandered by these horrible people who are corrupting the great accomplishments of your nation, past and
Mhm.
present. So that for me is pretty encouraging that they're on the right track.
Mm. It's interesting that you mentioned this shift back, the way the public, and particularly in the US, how the public views what the CIA does and what it is, and often that's also fueled by how like Hollywood and movies and talk about it. There is, I think maybe I'm wrong, but historically, a big distrust at the moment in institutions across the world, and we've seen that in many places. But what do you think? will that impact the organization, and how do you navigate a world like that where the truth is no longer the truth in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, those are complex issues, and
Mm.
some of them are a bit different. I mean, the agency has always faced a public that really isn't sure what it is, what it does. Are they the good people? Or are they the bad people? I was I was flicking through Netflix the other day, and I saw a trailer for Covert Affairs, some program, right? And here's this supposed to be this female intelligence operative, and like multiple scenes in the trailer, she's getting shot at, blown up, whatever, and that's just like one day. And I'm thinking, yeah, I got shot at, missile, rocketed, car bombed a few times over 40 years. So I think people see what the mission is very different. I think the agency is limited in the amount of transparency to which it can offer the public. But to that end, I think it has to be better about it. I think the controller for British MI6 has made some speeches. The current one and the previous one, Director Burns, prior to his departure, made comments about, we can't tell you necessarily how we do things, but we need to be sufficiently transparent so that we have your trust at the end of the day. In the United States, we have an oversight process. In theory, it's those elected officials, congressmen, the senators that people elect, who are the ones that sit in on those meetings, who do get to see precisely what we do and are supposed to be the eyes and ears on behalf of the public. But people are going to largely take what they see from the media. On the not trusting institutions, yeah, that's just a political dynamic, and certainly the CIA is going to suffer from that, like everybody else. But I think that goes way beyond just the CIA. People don't trust the courts anymore. They don't trust their elected officials to a degree that I've never seen in my lifetime. And unfortunately, sometimes our own politicians exacerbate that risk for what might be their short-term needs, which is often populist politics, at the cost of leaving ourselves vulnerable to foreign rivals. Because clearly our adversaries, authoritarian states and such like that, are going to leverage that and take advantage of that. And in this technical landscape in which we live, in which people are overwhelmed by data, they get overwhelmed by media and information, and they start selectively editing from where they want to get their media and from whom they're going to trust. That is sort of open season for an adversary to amplify what suits their messaging and their agenda from whatever corner they find, and make it even more palatable in a way that further expands that political polarization that we're finding globally today.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is that inherently I wouldn't say the weakness, but um, the other side of being a free and open democratic country, that because of this discourse and everybody can participate in that, um, inherently that would give adversaries who don't have that, who clamp down on dissent, maybe an edge.
Yeah, if you look at least what's been released publicly over the last 8, 9 years by Western intelligence services, the influence efforts have evolved from where in the teens, 2015, 16, they were making up stuff. They were creating all these bots and such like that to pose as people. It was, you know, things that were authored and fabricated and given some sense, okay, this is real. Those things, particularly then, a little easier to filter out. Even today, I think we're able to find with their tradecraft being sloppy sometimes. But today, because there is such polarization and there's all these different elements that just believe what they want to believe, these adversaries can simply amplify themes that are already out there that fit their agenda, even though it's not true, it's inaccurate, but it favors them. And I think when people start yelling at each other in democratic countries, what they fail to realize is it's not about Russia or China being our friend or being our enemy. What they want, they just want to sow that tension. They want to create friction inside, because for our adversaries, it's often addition through subtraction. And if you could distract your rival, in this case, the United States or European countries or liberal democracies in East Asia and such like that. And they're so focused on home and people don't trust them anymore. That really weakens them to be a threat to Russia and China and Iran. So I think we see that getting even more refined and unfortunate. Um, Less inclination, perhaps, in some of our political leaders to kind of take a stand, even though that might risk their own popularity with some particularly fringe elements, and
Mm.
kind of call it out for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something that you mentioned it a little bit, and I had somebody on the podcast, Rick Prado, who also wrote an interesting book on COVID action and his experience on
Who
it.
was also in my original operational training class. We're good friends.
Really? Oh,
Yep.
wow. Okay. Small world. Um, and he mentioned something and he kind of complained about what Hollywood gets wrong, and the CIA is always portrayed as the boogeyman. But you mentioned just now on uh, Covert Affairs, the TV show. What do you think media gets generally wrong about the job? At least what you can say about it.
Yeah. So if you think about it, you're successful as a spy if your target doesn't know what's happened. You've robbed somebody, but they don't know they've been robbed, that kind of thing, right? If things are blowing up and they're shooting, probably somebody suspects something's going on. So a successful operation is one in which, you know, there's some tense moments, but you slip in, you do your thing, you slip out, and that's success. The agency equips its people to defend themselves and to deal with things if something goes wrong, and things sometimes go wrong because you can't plan for everything. But that's really the exception as opposed to the norm of how we operate. But that doesn't keep people watching TV. They want to see car chases and things blowing up and all that kind of stuff. And they also like to see there's always a bad guy in the good organization. There's always a mole. There's always somebody foiling things. We'd be pretty messed up if there were that many moles around, if that were that many bad apples, right? How secret could we be in accomplishing our mission if there were all these bad guys around doing those things? But it's more interesting. I mean, I've been a technical advisor. I was a technical advisor on one program that goes to Beirut, which is about the hunt for Mugnia, which I was involved with for times in my career, and I know that area. And I know the target and I know all that kind of stuff really, really well. And my job was to give some sense of realism because it was done as sort of a um, documentary, dramedy, kind of whatever, not dramedy, but of sorts. And there were times it's like, people would never do this. It's like, yeah, but this is more interesting. And that's how we develop the character. So I think it's just the reality of show business, which is why, for maybe like Rick, I don't know if he said this, I can't watch spy stuff. It's just like, "Oh my god, that's just absolutely ridiculous," kind of thing. I mean, the few spy things I like are like comedies. There's a couple of movies that I just think are hilarious that at some points actually get closer to the truth than than the action flicks do. But certainly no one's ever confused me for like the Jason Bourne or James Bond characters. Um, which sad as that might be for my ego is good because my job is to be pretty great.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the interesting thing that I think a lot of people get wrong is what they understand a gray man to be,
Yeah.
and that's not wearing a baseball cap and tactical pants and
Yeah.
checkered shirts.
Because then if you need to find a spy, you just look for people wearing, cargo
Yeah.
pants. And okay, there anybody wears cargo pants and a baseball
Yeah.
hat, they're a spy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because and then I mean experience, not just doing this podcast, but um, for my work and everything is I think gray actually means the most normal dads, and moms that you could think of
Yeah.
doing this job and unassuming people that you would never think, which is what you really need in a situation like that.
Absolutely. I mean, and we raise our kids abroad. We raise our kids while we're spying. I mean, there are certain assignments that I couldn't take my family because they're just too dangerous an area to be in. But for the most part, most of my career was traveling with my family, and there's a normalcy. And I think for me, and maybe it's, occupational hazard, maybe you and I share that, right? Is that gray is much more open. Black and white is extreme. Black and white is closure to other possibilities. Gray is more, let's learn, let's keep learning, and let the reality teach us what our decision making should be. I think makes a lot more sense.
Hmm. And in your career, obviously you've progressed along your career. You've been in many places and you wore many different hats. How is it from a perspective of you're the case officer as opposed to a station chief? And like, is that, how different is that? And how do you manage both roles?
Yeah, that's really probably a personal preference thing. I've been a chief station. I was a COS 3 times. I was a chief of base of someplace in a war zone. Personally, for me, it's more fun to be a case officer. I enjoyed that a lot more. I enjoyed the operations. I think even when I was a COS or was in management, I tried to sort of be in that sort of player coach role where I could still do some things operationally, but probably far more limited. For one, my cover was far more limited. I might not have gone around saying I was CIA, but people knew that I was CIA, at least the people that counted, like the rivals and such. It did not mitigate from me still recruiting some of them and spying with them because, sometimes it allows simply for that contact and opportunity. But when you're a chief of station, it's much more focused on the institution, communicating up, making sure nobody's surprised. There's going to be some politics involved, like in any bureaucracy, private sector, public sector, anywhere in the world. You've got a lot more to worry about. You've got to worry about everybody else. You've got to trust a lot more people because you're delegating and empowering, which is very much part of your job. You're teaching, you're educating. Always, I think a chief of station's job is to continue to develop and cultivate the people that are working for him or her out there. And there's a great deal of responsibility. And it's funny to say that because the case officer, you're responsible for people's lives. So it's like, that sounds pretty responsible. But you could just focus on spying. I mean, you also got to focus on your cover job because when you're doing that, the deeper your cover, the more time consuming is your cover job. That literally is a full-time job. So you have two full-time jobs. You're, you know, selling dog food or whatever, your cover might be, not that that was ever mine. Um, but you're, also spying, right? But you could just focus on that. And I think I grew took so much energy from stealing secrets, from having relationships with people that were strong and meaningful, mutual trust. That I think for me, that was personally more rewarding. I would suggest to you that any number of my colleagues would say just the opposite. It's like, yeah, it was okay being a case officer. I really like being a chief of station. I had more influence. I was able to impact policy and direction and whatever like that. That's all true. And I have my moments. I met heads of states and I did back channel diplomacy, which was also exciting and fun. I talked about some of that in my book. But for me, the coolest thing was being a spy, was stealing a manual on the latest fighter aircraft of your enemies and then sending it back home so we could reverse engineer and know all of its weaknesses. That for me is, that's pretty cool.
I can imagine. So, um, I mean, obviously the world is always changing. I think spying in a way more dangerous um, or even easier. In your time, if you can say, can you point to any adversaries that you either in a way respected because of their tradecraft, or that you say, hey, we really need to be sharp with the, I mean, you always have to be, obviously, but that you worried about more than others, that you would say these are, or you don't really do that?
I don't. I think, human beings are all different. Some people might. I think it's really dangerous to do that. I think it puts you in a position where you might take certain adversaries for granted. I think my organization did that at times and had our lunch handed to us by countries, groups, people that we didn't think much of. So I think that's terribly dangerous. I think the opposite has to be kept in mind too, that they're not 10 feet tall. People think the Russians are really cool. Well, they think that because the Russians have done all these assassinations and sabotages. But why do they know that? Because the Russians suck at tradecraft and they are always caught. So, they just are, and their agents are always wrapped up and they're always caught. So it's like, oh wow, they had all these agents. Yeah, but we found them all. They've all gone or been arrested. So I think there's a danger going to either side, to either imbuing too much in your adversaries, like, oh, they're super people, or taking them too lightly. I took everybody pretty seriously, but I never was intimidated by them. I think people will say the same thing, and again, I hope I don't alienate any parts of your audience, but Mossad's a very capable group, but a lot of people know about what Mossad's done because Mossad's been caught a lot too. So, what does that tell you? The less you hear about an organization, that would probably suggest the better they are at what they're doing because you don't know where they've been and you don't know what they've done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And on the side of allies, who have you, if you can say, who impressed you most that you walked alongside and you would say you've been
Yeah,
able to learn the most,
I
maybe?
obviously I need to respect everyone, and I've
Yeah,
worked
of
with
course.
many, many partners,
Yeah.
all of whom had different strengths and weaknesses. And that's, in all parts of the world, whether it was Europe or the East or Central Asia or South Asia. Some services are organized to be better at some functions than others, right? So it's probably unfair to say, oh, they're not as good at this and as this service was at that, because that's what's important to them. They focus on something. But they're all capable in their own way. And I think one of the things that is a concern is, with technology, transnational groups could be pretty effective adversaries that one has to be wary of. Individuals, criminals, can be pretty effective leveraging technology that allows them to collect intelligence that they need to conduct whatever crime it may be it cyber or otherwise, or corporate espionage, insider threat, as we talk about so often today. That it's a much more dangerous world, is what I'll say. There's a lot more capability among states and also among non-state actors today than certainly ever in my lifetime.
It's interesting because there's always debates. There's a story that I once heard in the UK where um, an analyst was doing research, and I think it was an MI6 analyst was doing research, and they were looking at Al Qaeda, and they were not set up properly on doing the research technically, and um, looking at websites and tracked her back, sent her a Christmas card.
Oh,
And I was like, how do you even do that from home? It's
oh
pretty
yeah.
crazy. But yeah, that was, I don't know if it was just to scare us all when we were doing certain training, but that I found very interesting that they were that capable of a transnational group doing something like that. But as you said, the technology is a great equalizer in that sense.
It really is. It's a great leveler, isn't it? Yeah,
Mm.
precisely.
What is your opinion on the? I mean, it's always existed, but the rise of private intelligence. And when I say private intelligence, I don't mean private intelligence in the sense where in the US people leave the service and then get contracted back doing the same job as
Mhm.
they were before, but more in a more independent sense of private intelligence.
It's certainly a lucrative opportunity these days. There's
Mm.
any number of predictive intelligence groups that have come along, right? That are trying to sell their wares to the private sector to anticipate issues that companies will face with their investments and where they have a presence. And I don't mean to sound too, critical of them in a sense, because they're necessary, right? I think even the smallest business these days, despite what's going on with these trade wars, the global economy is very, very integrated. All these supply chains are very, very integrated. And companies have a presence and a dependency on things going on very far away. Sometimes they don't even really realize it because some widget that they make is actually being used by some other, company. So there's a need for them to have a little more insight and vision forward so they could plan more effectively and they could scope their investments and understand, where are we vulnerable. There's a great need for that, and I think open source intelligence provides a great opportunity for that. It depends though on them having the right people and people who know how to use information, whether it's open or not, and know how to leverage. There's opportunities for the same sort of holistic approach to information gathering that private companies could do, where there's commercial imagery, there's access to a fair amount of social media out there. There's companies that do particular research. They say that they leverage the dark web, and the dark web is nothing more than people selling things that they've stolen anonymously. Bellingcat does that all the time. The investigative group, they, use motor vehicle records, military awards, all sorts of stuff that Russians have sold or Chinese have sold and such like that. So the problem is in the amount of information that's out there is a great deal. Most of that information could tell you what's happened as opposed to what will happen. And then people are applying various algorithms that try to take a predictive look. That's where they are lacking because what they lack is the human piece that espionage gives you in terms of the context. What are all these events and happenings? What are all these ship movements and what we see in commercial imagery and what we see on social media? What does it all mean? So I've had the opportunity in some cases to, see some of these companies. Sometimes they brought me in to take a look or whatever. And I tell them it's about their talent pool. They could get the data. Somebody will sell it to them, provide it to them, whatever. But do they have people that have sort of the experience? And I'm not just marketing myself. Not that I mind if somebody wants to hire me. But it talks about having people kind of understand how to crunch the numbers and crunch the data. And what I find actually, and again, God knows I'm alienating somebody, companies tend to hire law enforcement people. They think law enforcement people are the best folks to give them an eye towards folks who are going to cyber attack me, sabotage my company. I would tell you, I was the predator. I was the
Yeah.
one for 40
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
sabotaging,
Yeah.
stealing, whatever like that. I have a much better idea on what your vulnerabilities are than, a law enforcement person may. Law enforcement folks are very much on defense, defense. I understand kind of the offensive piece to allow for defense, and not just me in particular, obviously, but you yourself, Ahmed, and others who've done what we've done, because we know what an insider threat looks like because we met them, right? We recruited them, we ran them, and it's not the stereotypes you see on television. And we say things, at least I do, which some companies don't necessarily want to hear. It's like your work environment is your first line of defense.
Yeah.
People have reason to have a grievance against you because how they feel treated, or maybe what they think your politics are. Not
Mhm.
saying to change what countries you sell to, but you need awareness at least
Yes.
of where
Absolutely.
you might be vulnerable. And you need holistic programs internally with employee buy-in, where they don't
Mhm.
think it's all big brother and toxic and such like that,
Yeah.
so that you could look forward and protect yourself. So yeah, it's a much more dangerous world for the private sector today,
Mhm.
uh, because again, hybrid warfare is economic very much in nature. We
Mhm.
see cyber attacks, we see sabotage, we see ransomware. Yeah, there's a lot of criminal groups, but a lot of these groups are connected to state actors at
Absolutely.
the end of the day. And there's a reason they're doing it, and there's a timing for what they're doing. So I think corporate boards need to be much more involved. Some corporate
Mhm.
boards, at least in America, hardly ever met. They met a couple times
Mhm.
a year.
Yeah.
Folks like that need to be more engaged and saying, "What's going on? Are we integrated? Are we synced up?" Because,
Mhm.
and I'm sorry if I'm off on some tangent, but,
No, no,
you
no.
know
I love all of this.
okay.
Yeah.
Companies can't just have, "Okay, here's our HR people, they do their HR stuff, and they're living in a vacuum. Here's our security people, here's our IT people." they've all got to be integrated today.
Mhm.
They've all got to be talking
Mhm.
in a way that is holistically looking at issues and then taking advantage of what's
Mhm.
available to them. And
Mhm.
certainly liberal democracies that, having your own Intel workshop or hiring some company to do it for you, but also having relationships with the government, with,
Mhm.
the Interior Ministry or the security services, stuff like that. That's kind of important. We're kind of lucky in the States. A number of the biggest cyber attacks we found were found by the private sector, and they told
Mhm.
us as
Mhm.
opposed to the other way around. So I think there have to be a lot more partnerships out there
Mhm.
between private sector and the government, as well as what the private sector is doing on their own. But I don't think any private sector element is immune from the threats that we face today.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned it in the US. I think there's a lot more integration and openness of the craft of intelligence and how it can improve, and even not just on a risk side. I've talked about this in another podcast on opportunities. Intelligence can create opportunities for an organization too, which I don't think it's highlighted enough. But for me, what I see, since we're a British company, and we're looking at Europe and the UK, it's fairly good, but in Europe, that's still like very far away. Where
Mhm.
that understanding and that acceptance that hey, you need to really, you cannot live in the world that you thought you were in 20 years ago. The
Right.
world has changed, and this is also something I'm trying to improve. One of the reasons why I do this podcast is also for leadership, to understand how to consume intelligence.
Yeah.
Right, to get the shop is one thing, but if you do not know how to ask the right questions, then what's the benefit?
I love what you said there, consume intelligence.
Mhm.
In my classes, and I teach, grad level classes on intelligence, and I teach analysis. I teach human operations.
Mhm.
But what I tell them is, at the end of the semester, you're not going to be a case officer, God
Mhm.
forbid, in a
Mhm.
sense. So you're not going to be an intel analyst, but you will be a better consumer of information, a better consumer of intelligence, because you'll have a greater appreciation to that landscape, how it works, where we get intelligence from, how it's used, its credibility, its reliability, and how you can leverage it both offensively and defensively. So
Mhm.
I love your line. I talk about being a savvy intelligence consumer
Mhm.
is very important for the private sector, and I think these are folks that are trained in business and making money and widgets and mathematical columns that they sometimes need to take a moment and integrate that savviness as a good consumer of information into what they're doing, which will then empower them and enable them to be more effective at their day job.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something you mentioned also earlier. I mean, there's such a, especially with the rise of OSINT and big data and data analytics, there's such an emphasis on tools, right? And not enough emphasis on, as you mentioned, okay, what's the context?
Right.
How do I use these tools? And do you have the right talent pool, as you mentioned, right? And this is something also I see is that from a hiring perspective, but also from a training perspective, you get these people and then you say, hey, this is how we do things. And then you give them the tools. And then tools often are pushed from top down
Yeah.
instead of
Very
asking
true.
what they need, right? So you get these expensive tools that you're paying maybe $100,000, $200,000 a year for, but your team doesn't even like using them, right? So this is something that, from your experience, how do you overcome something like that? Is that through what you mentioned as connecting more and listening more?
I think there has to be a lot more communications.
Mhm.
And your example is very illustrative, having these great tools. And a lot of intelligence work is based on links and timelines, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's wonderful tools. Palantir was at the forefront here in the States about coming up with
Mhm.
all these link analysis tools and such, and then selling data, whatever. And a lot of companies are doing that. That's a lot of predictive intelligence is linking things, people, events, planning, and what have you, crunching OSINT and such like that. But if the
Mhm.
folks doing that don't get the sort of bigger context for what are they looking,
Mhm.
right? what are the dynamics that an adversary needs to conduct a cyber attack, conduct physical sabotage, recruit an insider to give them proprietary information. They need that context, that sort of big umbrella under
Mhm.
which to, as you said, use these great shiny, sexy tools properly, because the tool's going to do what you ask it to do. And then it's going to spit out data, and it's going to offer you its interpretation, but again, based
Mhm.
on what you asked it to look for.
Mhm.
And it's very often the subtleties that you need to really appreciate, interpret the data, that makes all these tools and data worthwhile in the first place. And that requires communication, and that requires education, and that requires looking at past cases, but not fighting the past, not fighting
Mhm.
the last threat. What does the past case mean for how the threat's going to evolve? And that requires a little bit more communication, education, and interpretation.
Since you're on education side and you've educated a lot of young people and trained a lot of young people also at your time at CIA. Um, this is the part always that I love in the podcast is where I ask, what advice would you give somebody that they've either read your book or they've heard this podcast or they're just interested in getting into the profession? What would you advise them on?
So there's no set of boxes, as you know, that you can
Mhm.
check, right? There
Mhm.
are things that help as opposed to things that hurt. But what I encourage folks, if you want a life in intelligence, at least for U.S. Intel services, they'll train you in tradecraft, whether it's operational or analytic. But we can't train you in experience. We can't train you in your sort of own outlook on life. I encourage people to stretch beyond their comfort zones, doing things that they think, are uncomfortable, maybe meeting new people, traveling, experiencing new things. It's not just about substance expertise in an area, though that certainly helps on the analytics side and on the technical side, right? Folks with IT backgrounds are going to have a value, great value in cyber engineers and such like that. And those who want to be analysts, if they're going to be hired to analyze China or Russia, what have you, should get the book knowledge. But it's particularly for those on the collection side who want to do that, it's about being comfortable in different circumstances with different people and in different places. And I think the more you get, whether that's doing philanthropic work, donating your time, uh, dealing with people who are in need, houses for humanity, whatever, that sort of thing, those are actually good experiences. I mean, folks who go in the military say, oh, well, if you have a military background, it's going to help you. Yeah, it does, because the military gives you a lot of that. It makes you travel to places you've never been, see people you've never met, do things you've never done, but it does the same thing kind of thing. So it doesn't necessarily require that. So I tell people to be, ravenous in what they read and what they do, and not to pass up on experiences and to try different things in life. And for one thing, it makes them more interesting as people. And I would submit to you, the more interesting you are as a person, the more value you have as an intelligence officer, because you're somebody who's going to engage others more effectively. I think anyone in the intelligence business needs empathy, whether you're a spy collecting and having to deal with people, or you're analyzing what a country or a non-state actor is going to do. There's a lot of judgment in the world, and there's no place for judgment in espionage. In espionage, it's all about I need an understanding of my enemy as well as my friends, so that I can engage them, maybe recruit them, and certainly understand where they're coming from and what they're doing and what's in the future. And you can't do that if you try to apply your logic, your values, your perspective. Not saying you condone others, but you need to understand others. You need to be able to walk a mile in their shoes and see the world through those eyes. So those are kind of some of the suggestions I make to students I have, and even students I train for the agency.
Yeah, a very, I think, very valuable information. I think a lot of people talk about skills, right? I think they don't often say why those skills are important, and I think empathy is huge.
Yep.
I don't think I don't. I'm not sure if anybody ever mentioned that during the podcast. So I think I thank you for that. You've mentioned that you don't really watch anything, or you don't like to watch anything spycraft and this type of stuff. But at the end of the podcast, we always like to ask our guest, "Hey, what are you reading at the moment? What are you listening to? Maybe any podcast? What are you watching? Right? And any cultural recommendation. It doesn't even have to be around, intelligence or anything like that, but just also this is kind of also for me because I get a lot of good recommendations from out of this. But yeah, I would love to hear from you if you could give us some tips.
So I just got a book written by a friend of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Rogg, who's an intelligence historian and one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he just published a book. I think it's Intelligence in the State or The Spy in the State. If you look up Jeffrey Rogg, ROGG, you'll find it. It's brand new out there, like on Amazon. It's he's a brilliant guy, and I haven't read through it yet, but I plan to, and I'm really excited about it. Daniela Rictovera, who's a friend of mine, she's an educator at King's College. She wrote Catching the Jackals or Chasing the Jackals. I'm terrible at titles, so forgive
Mhm.
me, Daniela, that I'm sure you could find it. A really interesting look at what the then Czechoslovakian service did with terrorist groups.
Mhm.
And some of it sort of argues against probably some folks' preconceptions of what they were doing and why they were doing it. I think that was a good book. I like seeing the TV show, the what is it, the Bad Horses, Four Horses,
Oh yeah, slow horses.
Slow Horses.
Yeah.
It's absolutely unrealistic,
Yeah.
no semblance to reality, but
Yeah.
it's fun. It's good
Yeah.
espionage fun.
Yeah.
The Old Man was a program like for the very
Yeah.
same reason. Good fun, and as much as the things that happen, they're not gonna happen, their consultant was a CIA colleague of mine, retired, and as occasionally there's a line about the how the guy looks at the world and feels about himself, and when he looks inward and looks in people, which was spot on.
Mhm.
The blowing things up, the shooting people, okay, not so much, but some of the perspectives I thought, "Wow, that's yeah, that's right," kinda thing. So,
Yeah.
those are some of the things I've been watching and reading and will be reading in the future.
Yeah. Great. I'm gonna find Daniela's book because I would love to have her on the podcast. I haven't asked her, but I've seen her stuff on LinkedIn and
Oh, she's
I know
great.
her work.
Yeah, she's a great speaker, and I'm sure she'd love the opportunity to come on.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Thank you so much. If Do you have any questions for me?
You know what, you're talking about your audience that's watching the show,
Mhm.
and, how do you see as the primary mission of your podcast for your audience?
What a great question. Um, I think for me, I started out just this podcast because I know what my experience is, but I wanted to learn from others. And and then if I can learn from others while also the audience can learn together with me, that's great. So it's mainly for me, it was an educational journey and great networking. But I think for the audience, it's like, hey, it's a profession, right? It's not really mysterious, right? And I think we do ourselves a disservice of making it this secretive, mystical type of thing. And it's not. It's a job. Yes, an interesting one, but and also I don't think there are many podcasts where people talk about their experiences as human beings. It's bombastic. The podcast that you see, like, hey, what's the best rifle, or hey, what's the la when you what's the- when did you felt that you were almost about to die, and it doesn't have to be sensationalized. It can be interesting in itself. So I think the craft of intelligence, of spycraft, is what interests me. And so I do the podcast mainly for me, really, that the audience is bonus. So that's the motivation, if that makes any sense.
No, those are fabulous answers, and they'll certainly keep me tuning back in.
Yeah. Um, Thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate you taking the time. I really loved your book. I read your book and then John told me about you, and I was like, I know him. I read his book. So I really appreciate you taking the time of doing this and sharing. And I think you've shared more insights about the profession than anybody that's been on this podcast, I think. And it's mainly because you already know what you can and cannot say. So that
Wow.
obviously helps. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Been my great pleasure. Thank you.
And to everybody, to the audience, thank you for all the support, and please keep giving feedback. I really appreciate it. That's something that I'm trying to improve and learn from. So if you guys have any questions or any recommendations, I would love to hear. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you, and bye-bye.